"Your card has been declined, ma'am." The words didn't come out loud. Not really. But the screen said everything it needed to, glowing in cold blue beneath the hospital's fluorescent lights, as Naomi Carter stood there in a thin cotton gown, her newborn wrapped against her chest, barely 7 pounds of quiet breathing and warmth. While the machine blinked again, as if giving her a second chance to fix something she had no power left to fix, and behind her, she could feel it before she heard it. The faint click of heels, slow, measured, deliberate, followed by the familiar voice she once knew better than her own heartbeat. Daniel Brooks, calm as ever, almost bored, saying her name like it was something he had already decided to forget. Naomi. And she turned just enough to see him standing there, not alone, never alone anymore. Chloe Whitman at his side, perfectly composed, her coat tailored, her hair untouched by the kind of night Naomi had just lived through, the kind that stretched across 12 hours of pain and silence and empty waiting rooms. And for a moment the world narrowed to something painfully simple. The weight of her child in her arms, the unpaid bill on the screen, and the man who had once promised to build a life with her now standing a few feet away as if none of it belonged to him, as if none of it ever had. And Daniel didn't step forward, didn't reach out, didn't even glance at the baby. His eyes flicked briefly to the monitor, then back to Chloe, who leaned in slightly, whispering something that made him nod, distracted, already elsewhere. And Naomi adjusted her hold on the baby, her fingers steady despite the exhaustion that pressed into her bones. And the nurse behind the counter shifted awkwardly, offering a polite smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Do you have another form of payment?" she asked, gentle, practiced, as if this moment happened every day, as if it didn't split something open inside Naomi that would never quite close the same way again. And for a second, just one, Naomi considered turning around, saying his name, asking him to step up, to do what he once swore he would always do. But the thought passed through her like a shadow, brief and silent, because something in the way he stood there, relaxed, untouched, already detached, told her everything she needed to know. And instead she looked back at the screen, then down at her daughter's face, small and calm, unaware of the quiet fracture happening in the space between adults. And Naomi exhaled slowly, not a sigh, not a sob, just a measured breath, and said, "I'll take care of it." Her voice even, almost too even, as she reached into her worn bag, pulling out the one card she hadn't used yet, knowing it wouldn't change anything, knowing the answer before the machine could give it. And sure enough, the same blue light flickered again, final this time, and behind her, she heard Daniel shift, heard Chloe murmur something soft and reassuring, heard the faintest trace of impatience. And that was when Naomi understood, not in words, not in anger, but in something quieter, heavier, that this wasn't a moment that would pass. This was the moment everything ended, and without turning back, without asking, without giving him the chance to pretend later that he hadn't known, she gathered her things, adjusted the blanket around her newborn, and stepped away from the counter, leaving the screen glowing behind her, leaving him exactly where he had chosen to stand. And as she walked toward the exit, the automatic doors sliding open to the early morning air just beginning to warm above the parking lot, she didn't look back, not once, because somewhere, between the silence of that hospital room and the cold light of that payment screen, Naomi Carter had already understood something that would change the rest of her life, that the moment he chose another woman over his family wasn't the moment she lost everything. It was the moment she stopped waiting to be chosen at all. There was a time when Naomi Carter used to measure her life in promises, in small sentences whispered across cheap dinner tables and late-night drives, in the quiet certainty that Daniel Brooks would one day become the man he said he was going to be, and she believed him in ways that felt permanent, the kind of belief that makes you ignore the warning signs because the future looks brighter than the present. And she could still remember the first apartment they shared, barely 600 square feet, the heater that rattled every winter, the kitchen light that flickered if you turned it on too fast. And yet she had smiled there more than anywhere else, standing barefoot on cold tile while stirring instant coffee, listening to Daniel talk about ambition like it was already his, like success was just waiting for him to arrive. And she had worked 2 jobs back then, morning shifts at a small cafe on the corner of Maple Street and late-night bookkeeping for a local contractor. her hands always smelling faintly of coffee grounds and paper, while Daniel chased opportunities that never quite landed, and every time something fell through, she was the one who said it would be okay, the one who paid the bills, the one who kept the lights on when the account balance dropped lower than it ever should have. And he would take her hand, look at her with that same steady confidence, and say, "This is temporary, Naomi. One day I am going to give you everything." And she had nodded, not because she needed everything, but because she believed in him enough to wait for it. And when she told him she was pregnant, there had been a moment, just a second, where his smile did not quite reach his eyes, but it disappeared so quickly she convinced herself it had never been there. And instead he hugged her, told her they would figure it out, told her this was the start of something bigger, something real, and she held on to that version of him even as things began to shift in ways she could not fully explain. Late nights that turned into missed calls, conversations that grew shorter, his attention drifting somewhere she could not follow. And then one evening, he came home wearing a shirt she had never seen before, carrying a kind of energy that felt distant, unfamiliar. And when she asked, he said it was nothing, just work, always work, and Naomi chose to believe. That too, because belief had always been easier than doubt, and because she was already carrying a life that depended on stability, not questions. And so she kept moving forward, kept building around the cracks. She refused to name, until the day those cracks became something she could no longer ignore. The day she saw Chloe Whitman for the first time, standing just a little too close to Daniel at a company event Naomi had almost not attended, their laughter timed too perfectly, their silence too comfortable, and Naomi stood there in a simple dress she had worn twice before, her hand resting unconsciously over her growing stomach, watching a version of her life begin to rewrite itself in real time, without asking her permission. And even then, even in that moment, she did not make a scene, did not demand answers, because something inside her had already started to shift, something quieter, stronger, the beginning of a truth she would not fully understand until much later, that sometimes the person you are waiting for to become better is already choosing not to, and sometimes the strongest thing you can do is not to hold on tighter, but to notice when you are the only one still holding anything at all. The night after the hospital did not arrive with closure. It arrived with silence, the kind that settled into the corners of a small apartment Naomi Carter had not planned to return to alone, a place that still carried traces of a life that no longer existed. One toothbrush missing from the holder, one side of the closet empty, the faint outline of where Daniel Brooks used to leave his keys by the door. And Naomi stood there for a moment with her newborn in her arms, the soft hum of the refrigerator the only sound filling the space as the city outside moved on without noticing anything had changed. And she stepped inside slowly, careful not to wake the baby, setting her down in a borrowed bassinet near the couch, the fabric slightly worn but clean, a small act of kindness from a neighbor who had knocked earlier that afternoon without asking too many questions. And Naomi lowered herself onto the edge of the couch, her body still heavy from everything it had endured, her mind even heavier with everything it now understood. And for the first time since leaving the hospital, she allowed herself to look at her phone, the screen lighting up with a list of messages she had not opened, numbers she recognized, a few she did not, but none from Daniel, not a single word asking if they had made it home safely, not a question about the baby, not even a simple acknowledgement of what he had walked away from. And Naomi stared at the empty space where his name used to appear so often it had felt permanent. And she felt something shift again, not sharp, not loud, just a quiet adjustment inside her chest, like something fragile settling into a new shape. And she set the phone down without replying to anyone, without announcing anything, because there was nothing left to explain. And the baby stirred then, a small sound, barely a cry, and Naomi leaned forward instinctively, lifting her with practiced care despite how new everything still was, holding her close, feeling the steady rhythm of her breathing. And in that moment the world narrowed again, but this time it did not feel like loss, it felt like focus, like clarity. And Naomi stood, moving through the apartment, with slow, deliberate steps, turning on a lamp instead of the harsh overhead light, filling the room with a softer glow that made everything look less broken than it felt. And she found a clean bottle, measured out formula with careful precision, 2 ounces, then another, her hands steady now, her movements purposeful, as if each small task was a decision to keep going. And when she sat back down, feeding her daughter in the quiet of that room, she did not think about Daniel, not the man he was, not the promises he had made, because something inside her had already closed that door without needing to slam it. And instead she watched the way her daughter's tiny hand curled instinctively around her finger, the way she trusted without question, and Naomi understood that whatever came next would not be built on what she had lost, but on what she still held. And the realization did not come with relief or triumph. It came with a calm acceptance that settled deeper than any emotion she had felt before. And as the minutes passed, the city lights outside dimming into early morning, Naomi Carter made a decision that no one else would hear, no one else would witness, but it would define everything that followed. That she would not chase what had already chosen to leave. She would not explain herself to someone who had already stopped listening. And she would not break under the weight of a moment that was never meant to define her. And when her daughter finally fell asleep in her arms, Naomi leaned back against the couch, her eyes open, steady, and unafraid of the quiet, because for the first time, the silence no longer felt like abandonment. It felt like the beginning of something she would build on her own terms. The mornings did not announce themselves with hope. They arrived quietly, almost cautiously, slipping through the thin curtains of Naomi Carter's apartment in soft strips of pale sunlight that touched the floor before reaching her. And most days she was already awake before the light found her, sitting at the small kitchen table with a cup of coffee gone lukewarm, her laptop open, the screen filled with numbers and documents that demanded her attention long before she felt ready to give it. And across the room her daughter slept in the bassinet, a steady rhythm Naomi had begun to trust, not because it was easy, but because it was consistent, and consistency had become more valuable than comfort. And Naomi learned quickly that survival was not a single decision, but a series of small, repeated choices, waking up even when her body asked for more rest, answering emails while gently rocking the bassinet with her foot, measuring out formula with one hand while reviewing spreadsheets with the other, every movement precise, efficient, quiet. And over time those small choices began to build something that did not look like success from the outside, but felt like control from within. And she found work wherever she could, freelance bookkeeping, data entry, financial summaries for small businesses that needed accuracy more than conversation, and she delivered everything on time, every time, never asking for extensions, never offering explanations, because she had learned that the world rarely made room for stories, only results. And her name began to circulate in small circles, not loudly, not dramatically, but steadily, like a whisper that carried weight. And one afternoon, weeks blending into months without ceremony, an email appeared that did not look like the others, the sender's name unfamiliar, the subject line simple, direct, requesting a consultation for a larger project, something structured, long-term. And Naomi hesitated for a moment, not out of fear, but out of instinct. The kind that had sharpened since the day she stopped waiting for things to feel certain, and she opened the message, reading each line carefully, noting the clarity, the absence of unnecessary language, the expectation of precision, and she replied the same way she approached everything now, calm, direct, without embellishment. And when the response came back, it was immediate, a scheduled call, a time set without negotiation. And on the day of the meeting, Naomi prepared the same way she always did, reviewing documents, organizing her notes, adjusting the small space around her so that everything felt intentional, even if it was modest. And when the video call connected, the screen filled with a man who did not introduce himself with unnecessary warmth. Alexander Hayes, his tone measured, his question specific, his attention focused in a way Naomi recognized instantly, not on her story, but on her work. And she answered each question with the same clarity she had built over months of quiet effort, her voice steady, her explanations precise. And there was a moment, brief but noticeable, where he paused, not to challenge her, but to observe, as if recalibrating something he had expected to find differently. And when the call ended, he did not offer compliments, did not extend polite reassurance. He simply said, "Send me your proposal by the end of the day." And the line went silent. And Naomi sat there for a second, not interpreting, not assuming, just processing. And then she moved, her fingers already on the keyboard, her mind clear, her focus absolute, because somewhere along the way, without announcement, without applause, Naomi Carter had stopped building a life around what she had lost and started constructing something entirely her own, piece by piece, decision by decision, until even the quiet began to feel like momentum. The proposal was sent at exactly 4:47 in the afternoon, not rushed, not delayed, every number checked twice, every line intentional. And when Naomi Carter pressed send, she did not sit back and wait for validation. She closed her laptop, stood up from the small kitchen table, and walked over to the bassinet where her daughter had just begun to stir, the soft rustle of movement filling the quiet apartment. And she lifted her gently, holding her close against her shoulder as she moved through the familiar rhythm of her evening. Because no matter what came next, the routine remained, steady and grounding, and hours passed without interruption, the sky outside shifting from pale blue to deep gray, city lights flickering on one by one, and Naomi did not check her email again until later that night, after her daughter had fallen asleep. The apartment settling into that same calm silence she had come to understand not as emptiness, but as space. And when she opened her laptop, there it was, a single reply, no greeting, no unnecessary language, just a confirmation that the proposal had been received and a short message that read, "We will proceed." And beneath it, a formal contract attached, detailed, structured, precise in a way that mirrored everything she had sent. And Naomi read it carefully, line by line, her eyes scanning not for excitement, but for clarity, for understanding. Because she had learned that opportunities were not defined by how they appeared, but by how they held under attention, and everything about this one was solid, consistent, and when she reached the end, she did not hesitate. She signed her name, Naomi Carter, the same name that had once been tied to someone else's future, now standing on its own, and sent it back without adding anything more. And the following days shifted in a way that was subtle but undeniable. Her schedule became structured, her work more focused, the tasks more complex, requiring not just effort but precision, and Naomi met each one with the same quiet discipline she had built over months, never overextending, never cutting corners, and communication with Alexander Hayes remained minimal but exact, emails that contained only what was necessary, calls that began and ended on time, his presence consistent in a way that did not demand attention but commanded respect. And during one of those calls, after reviewing a set of financial projections that Naomi had reorganized entirely, there was a pause on the other end, not long, but deliberate, and he said, "You do not just complete the work, you improve it." His tone unchanged, but the words carrying weight, and Naomi acknowledged it. With a simple, "I make sure it works," because she did not need recognition, she needed results. And the conversation moved on, but something had shifted, not in her confidence, which had already taken root, but in the way her work was being seen, not as support, not as background, but as essential. And weeks turned into months, her apartment slowly reflecting the change, small upgrades, a better chair, a second monitor, shelves that held organized files instead of scattered papers, and through it all, Naomi remained the same in the ways that mattered, steady, focused, present, never looking back, never reaching out to what she had left behind, because the life she was building no longer required comparison. And one evening, as she closed her laptop after completing another set of reports, her phone lit up with a notification she had not expected, an invitation, formal, digital, tied to an event that carried a name she recognized instantly. The company Daniel Brooks had once struggled to grow, now hosting a large-scale anniversary gathering. And Naomi looked at the screen for a moment, her expression unreadable, her mind not rushing to react, because this was not about the past returning. It was about the present standing firmly enough that it no longer needed to avoid it. And she set the phone down beside her, her daughter sleeping peacefully in the next room, the apartment quiet, the air still. And in that stillness, Naomi Carter did not feel hesitation. She felt readiness. Not loud, not dramatic, just clear, like everything else she had built piece by piece until even moments like this no longer held power over her, but simply became another step forward. Naomi did not respond to the invitation right away, not because she was unsure, but because she no longer reacted to anything the moment it appeared. She had learned to let decisions settle, to give them space to reveal their weight before she carried them. And the phone remained on the table through the evening, the soft glow of the screen fading as the room dimmed into quiet. And she moved through her routine the same way she always did, preparing dinner, checking on her daughter, folding small pieces of laundry that seemed impossibly light in her hands, each movement steady, grounded, untouched by the name she had seen just hours before. And it was not until later, when the apartment had fallen completely still and her daughter was asleep, that Naomi returned to the table, picked up her phone, and opened the invitation again, reading it slowly, not skipping a single word, the date, the location, the formal language that dressed everything in importance. And she recognized the venue immediately. A place she had once only seen from the outside, a downtown building known for its glass walls and city views stretching for miles. The kind of place Daniel used to talk about as if it were a destination, a symbol of everything he wanted to reach. And now it was real, scheduled, structured, and inviting her in not as someone who had been left behind, but as someone expected to attend. And Naomi set the phone down again, her expression unchanged, because the difference between then and now was not where she was being invited. It was who she had become before receiving it. And the next morning, she approached the decision the same way she approached her work, with clarity, not emotion. She confirmed her attendance with a simple reply, no added message, no acknowledgement of history, just a presence marked on a list. And once it was done, she moved forward without revisiting it, because preparation had already become her default state. And in the days that followed, nothing about her routine broke. She continued working with the same focus, meeting every deadline, refining every detail. And during one of her scheduled calls, as they reviewed projections tied to the same company hosting the event, Alexander Hayes paused briefly before speaking, his voice measured as always, and he said, "You will be attending next week." Not a question, but a statement, and Naomi answered just as simply, "Yes." And there was a moment of silence, not uncomfortable, not uncertain, just deliberate, before he added, "Good." And the conversation continued without further explanation. But something in that exchange settled into place, something unspoken yet understood. And as the day of the event approached, Naomi made preparations that were not about appearance, but alignment. She selected a dress that fit cleanly, without excess, a deep tone that did not demand attention but held it when noticed. She arranged childcare with quiet efficiency, ensuring her daughter would be safe, cared for, her world uninterrupted by a night that belonged to something else. And on the evening itself, as the sun lowered over the city and the skyline reflected shades of gold and gray, Naomi stood in front of the mirror for a brief moment, not adjusting, not questioning, simply observing the person reflected back at her. And what she saw was not someone returning to prove anything, not someone seeking acknowledgement or closure, but someone who had already moved beyond the need for both. And when she stepped out of her apartment, locking the door behind her with a soft click, there was no hesitation in her movement, no weight in her steps, only a calm, steady presence that carried her forward. Because this was no longer about the place she was going or the people who would be there. It was about the fact that wherever she walked now, she arrived as someone who no longer needed to be chosen to belong. The building rose in glass and light against the evening skyline, every floor glowing with a quiet kind of authority that did not need to announce itself. And as Naomi Carter stepped out of the car, the city air carried a faint warmth, the kind that lingered just after sunset, wrapping around the movement of people dressed in tailored silhouettes and measured confidence. And she paused only for a second before moving forward, not to gather herself, but to observe, her gaze steady as she took in the entrance, the reflection of the doors, the subtle shift in posture from those approaching. And then she walked inside, her heels soft against the polished floor, her presence neither loud nor hidden, simply there. And the lobby opened into a space that felt expansive without being overwhelming. Conversations layered in low tones, glasses catching light as they moved between hands. And Naomi did not search the room. She allowed it to unfold around her, because she had learned that attention reveals itself without being chased, and it did not take long. A glance from across the room, a pause in a conversation, a slight shift in someone's stance, Recognition traveling quietly from one person to another, not of who she used to be, but of the name that had begun to circulate in ways that carried weight. And near the center of the room, Daniel Brooks stood with a glass in his hand, his posture relaxed, his voice confident as he spoke to a small group gathered around him. Chloe Whitman beside him, composed as always, her presence aligned perfectly with the image he had built, and for a moment, nothing changed. The room continued. The voices remained steady, and then Daniel's gaze moved, almost casually, until it landed on Naomi, and the shift was subtle, barely visible to anyone else, but unmistakable to those who knew what to look for. A fraction of hesitation, a recalibration that happened faster than a breath, and Naomi did not stop, did not turn away. She continued walking at the same pace, her expression calm, her focus forward, and when their paths finally aligned within the same space, there was no dramatic pause, no sudden silence, only a quiet awareness that something long past had intersected with something entirely new. And Daniel spoke first, his voice measured, controlled. Naomi, as if saying her name could anchor the moment back into something familiar. And she acknowledged him with a simple nod. Nothing more, not cold, not warm, just present. And Chloe offered a polite smile, the kind that belonged to social settings, not personal history. And Naomi returned it with the same level of distance, because there was nothing left to resolve in that exchange, nothing left to prove. And around them, the event continued, conversations resumed, attention shifted, but the space they occupied held a different kind of stillness, one that did not demand words, and Daniel adjusted his stance slightly, as if preparing to say something more, something that might reclaim control over a narrative he once believed he understood. But before anything else could form, a subtle movement near the entrance of the main hall drew attention across the room. A change in tone, in energy, as several individuals turned instinctively, their focus aligning toward a single point, and Naomi did not follow their gaze immediately. She remained where she was, grounded, unaffected by the shift, because whatever was about to unfold did not require her anticipation. It would arrive on its own, just as everything else had, in its time. And when she finally allowed her attention to move, it was not with curiosity, but with quiet recognition, as if she had already stepped into a moment that no longer belonged to the past, but to something far more defined, something that did not need to announce itself to be understood. The shift in the room was not loud. It was precise, like a current changing direction beneath the surface, and one by one, conversations softened, bodies angled slightly toward the same focal point. As Alexander Hayes stepped into the main hall, his presence unforced, his pace unhurried, and yet everything around him adjusted as if guided by an unspoken understanding. And Naomi Carter did not move toward him. She did not signal or acknowledge. She simply stood where she was, her posture steady, her gaze calm, because this moment was not something she needed to orchestrate. It was something she had already earned long before she arrived. And across the room, Daniel Brooks followed the same line of attention, his expression shifting in a way he could not fully control, recognition layered with something sharper, something uncertain, as he watched the man he knew by reputation, by influence, by the kind of authority that did not circulate publicly but defined outcomes quietly. And Alexander moved through the space with brief acknowledgments, a nod here, a word there, nothing extended, nothing wasted, until he reached the center of the room where the event host stepped forward, offering a formal greeting that carried just enough volume to draw the room into a single moment of focus. And it was there, in that brief pause between introduction and response, that Alexander's attention shifted, not outward, but directly toward Naomi. And the connection was immediate, not dramatic, not exaggerated, just clear, and he closed the distance between them with the same measured pace, stopping beside her with a familiarity that did not need explanation. And for the first time since entering the room, Naomi moved, not stepping forward, not stepping back, simply turning slightly to meet him, her expression unchanged, her presence aligned. And Alexander spoke just loud enough for those closest to hear. "You made it." A simple acknowledgement that carried more weight than any formal introduction could, and Naomi responded just as evenly. "I said I would." And there was no smile, no performance, just a quiet exchange that settled into the space between them as something established, something understood, and around them. The awareness spread quickly, conversations pausing, eyes shifting, the recognition not of who Naomi had been, but of who she stood beside, and the host, adjusting seamlessly, addressed the room once more, introducing Alexander formally, his role, his position, his influence tied directly to the future direction of the company. And then, without hesitation, he continued, and joining him as a strategic partner, the words landing with deliberate clarity, Ms. Naomi Carter. And the room responded not with surprise, but with a recalibration, a collective adjustment that moved through the space like a ripple, and Daniel stood still, his grip tightening slightly around the glass in his hand, his gaze fixed, not on Alexander, but on Naomi, as if trying to reconcile two versions of the same person that no longer aligned. And Chloe's expression remained composed, but her attention sharpened, following the shift with careful precision, and Naomi did not look toward them, did not acknowledge the weight of their recognition, because this moment was not about being seen by those who had once overlooked her. It was about standing fully in a place she had built without them, and Alexander, with a slight gesture, indicated the stage, not as a command, but as an invitation already accepted, and Naomi walked with him, her steps even, her presence unshaken, and as they stood before the room, the city lights stretching wide behind them through the glass walls, there was no need for explanation, no need for narrative, because everything that mattered had already been revealed in the simplest way possible, not through what was said, but through where she stood and who stood beside her. And in that stillness, Naomi Carter did not reclaim anything she had lost. She simply existed in a space where loss no longer defined her at all. The applause came, not loud, not overwhelming, but steady, controlled, the kind that belonged in rooms where decisions were made quietly and carried weight long after the sound faded. And Naomi Carter stood there beside Alexander Hayes without adjusting her posture, without searching the crowd for reactions, because she had already learned that validation given in moments could never compare to the stability built over time. And as the introduction concluded, Alexander spoke briefly about direction, about growth, about structure, his words measured and intentional, and Naomi listened without needing to add to it, because her presence there was not symbolic, it was earned. And when the attention shifted away from the stage and conversations began to resume, she stepped down with the same calm precision she had carried throughout the night, not lingering, not performing, simply moving forward as if this moment was one of many, not the culmination of anything. And as she reached the floor, Daniel Brooks approached, his steps slower than before, his confidence adjusted into something more careful, more deliberate, and for a brief second, the space between them held a version of the past that no longer had a place to stand, and he spoke her name again, softer this time, as if testing whether it still belonged to him in any way, Naomi. And she turned to face him fully, not guarded, not open, just present, and he searched her expression for something familiar, something he could recognize, but found only clarity. And there was a pause, long enough to reveal everything he could not say, long enough for the realization to settle that the person standing in front of him was no longer shaped by his choices, and he finally spoke. I did not expect. But the sentence did not complete itself, because there was no version of it that could carry what he meant without exposing what he had lost. And Naomi did not interrupt, did not fill the silence for him, because she no longer carried the responsibility of making things easier for him to understand, and instead she simply said, "That is all right." Her voice even, her tone calm, not dismissive, not forgiving, just true. And for a moment, that was enough. Enough to close something that had remained open far longer than it needed to be, and Daniel nodded slightly, his gaze dropping, for a fraction of a second before lifting again. But by then the moment had already passed, and Naomi turned, not abruptly, not dramatically, just naturally, as if the conversation had reached its end without needing to be forced there, and she moved through the room once more, not toward attention, not toward recognition, but toward the exit, her steps steady, her pace unchanged, and outside, the night air felt cooler now, the city lights reflecting off the glass behind her, and Alexander stood near the entrance, speaking briefly with someone before his attention returned to her. And there was no question in his expression, no need for explanation, only a quiet acknowledgement as he stepped beside her, matching her pace as they walked toward the street, and for a few moments, neither of them spoke, the silence comfortable, grounded, until he finally said, "You handled that well." And Naomi allowed a small breath to leave her, not quite a smile, but something close, and she replied, "It was already handled, because it was long before tonight, long before the stage, long before the recognition. It had been handled in the quiet moments, in the early mornings, in the decisions no one had seen." And as they reached the car, the city continuing around them without pause, Naomi Carter did not feel like she had won anything back. She had not returned to reclaim what was lost. She had moved forward until what was lost no longer mattered. And as she stepped inside, the door closing softly behind her, the final thought settled without resistance, clear and complete, that she had never needed to be chosen to become everything she was, because in the end, she did not win him back. She won herself.